After years of photographing weddings, creating albums, building portfolios, and even having some of my fashion and editorial work published, I found myself asking a question that honestly surprised me a bit. Why write a book? Photographs already exist. Albums already exist. Instagram exists. Websites exist. And if you're a photographer, especially a wedding photographer, most people assume your work should speak entirely through images. So why did I feel the need to explain something beyond the photographs themselves? And the answer, I think, is this. Because over time I realized that meaningful wedding photography is about much more than beautiful images. It's about process. It's about trust. It's about collaboration. It's about emotional presence. And maybe, most importantly, it's about understanding that the couple is not outside the artistic process. They are part of it. That realization is what led me to author Creating Meaningful Wedding Images Together. Not as a sales piece, not as a posing guide, not as a checklist, but as a conversation about what actually creates meaningful photographs in the first place. And that's what I want to talk about today. This is In Focus with Ken Clough Photography, a podcast about photography, weddings, storytelling, creativity, and the moments that stay with us long after the day itself is over. I'm Ken Clough, and today I want to talk about why I wrote my ebook, Creating Meaningful Wedding Images Together, and more importantly, the philosophy behind it, because over time, I've come to believe that wedding photography is not simply about hiring someone to take pictures. It's about understanding the experience you're creating together. Photographs show results, not process. One of the things I've realized over the years is that photographs are incredibly powerful, but they're also incomplete. A portfolio can show you what a wedding looked like. It can show beautiful light, composition, emotion, style, color, atmosphere. But photographs don't always explain why certain images feel meaningful. They don't fully explain the relationship behind them, or the trust behind them, or the emotional comfort that existed in that moment, or even the conversations that happened before the wedding day ever arrived. And I think that's important because wedding photography is often marketed in a very transactional way. Couples compare galleries, packages, hours, prices, deliverables, and social media highlights. And that all makes sense. Those things matter. But eventually I started realizing that some of the most meaningful images I created weren't necessarily about dramatic locations, or perfect lighting, or elaborate styling. They were about connection, about trust, about emotional openness, about a couple feeling comfortable enough to simply be present. And I realize that portfolios don't always communicate that part of the process very well. They show results, but they don't necessarily explain how those results came to exist. And that became increasingly important to me, because wedding photography is not just about technical execution. It's about people. It's about relationships. It's about emotional awareness. It's about understanding how to create an environment where authentic moments can actually happen. And I think that's something many couples never really talk about with a photographer. What fashion and editorial work taught me? A lot of people know me primarily as a wedding photographer, but I've also spent years doing editorial and fashion-inspired work. And honestly, that work changed the way I think about photography. Not because it made me more interested in perfection. Actually, it was almost the opposite. What editorial and fashion work taught me is that great images are deeply collaborative. There's this misconception sometimes that photographers simply create images on their own. But editorial work doesn't function that way. There are models, stylists, makeup artists, creative direction, movement, conversation, experimentation, trust, energy, and rhythm. The best images often emerge from interaction, from responsiveness, from people building something together in real time. And I realized over time that this collaborative process was something I deeply loved. Not just the final photograph, but the process itself. The communication, the creative flow, the observation, the subtle adjustments, the emotional awareness, learning how to guide someone without over-controlling them, learning how to create comfort, learning how to respond to a moment rather than force that moment. And honestly, that's part of why I continue doing editorial and fashion work. Not simply to build a portfolio, not simply for publication, but because living inside that collaborative creative process keeps those instincts sharp and natural for me. Over time, collaboration becomes second nature, and eventually I realize something important. Weddings work the same way. Not in the sense that weddings should feel staged or artificial, but in the sense that meaningful images emerge from collaboration there too. The emotion, the comfort, the trust, the willingness to be present, the communication between photographer and couple, all of those things shape the final work. And yet, most wedding photography conversations rarely talk about this. The missing conversation in wedding photography. I think most couples understandably see wedding photography as something that happens to them. You hire a photographer, the photographer shows up, the photographer takes photographs, the photographer delivers images, and there's nothing wrong with that perspective. That's the standard model most people encounter. But over time, I've come to believe that meaningful wedding photography is far more collaborative than people realize. Most couples don't think of themselves as part of the artistic process. They think the photographer is the artist, and they're simply being photographed. But the reality is much more connected than that. The emotional openness a couple brings into the day matters. Their trust matters. Their comfort matters. Their communication matters. Their willingness to slow down matters. And their presence matters. This does not mean that couples need photography expertise. It doesn't mean they need to know how to pose, or perform, or become models. Actually, I think the opposite is true. The less performative people feel, the more authentic the experience becomes. Because what I think matters is understanding that photography is relational. The strongest wedding photographs are rarely created by a photographer operating independently, like a machine simply documenting events. They emerge through interaction, through emotional trust, through shared understanding, through rhythm, through observation, and through moments where people feel safe enough to simply exist honestly in front of the camera. And I think that's part of wedding photography that often gets lost in modern wedding culture, because so much of the industry is now centered around output, content, highlights, fast turnaround time, and visual consumption. But again, none of these things are inherently bad. But I think the emotional and collaborative nature of photography gets overshadowed by the transactional side of the industry. And eventually, I realized I wanted to talk more about that openly, which is really part of why this ebook exists. Inviting couples into the process. One of the phrases I keep coming back to is this idea of inviting couples into the process, because I think that changes everything. It's not making couples perform, it's not making them feel pressured, and it's not making them feel like they have to become artistic people overnight. But it's helping them understand that their presence matters, their emotional experience matters, their trust matters, and their comfort matters. When couples understand the process a little more deeply, something interesting happens. They often relax. They stop worrying so much about doing it right. They stop trying to manufacture moments. They stop treating the camera like a test, and instead, they begin participating in the experience itself. That's where the meaningful images emerge. Not from perfection, but from connection. And honestly, I think this is one of the biggest differences between transactional wedding photography and collaborative wedding photography. Transactional photography says, stand here, look here, smile. Collaborative photography says, let's create an environment where meaningful moments can naturally happen. Those are very different philosophies. And over time, I realized I was much more interested in the second approach, because weddings are emotional. They're human, and they're unpredictable. And I think the most meaningful photographs come from allowing people the space to actually feel those experiences rather than constantly perform them. When couples and photographers share a common vision or purpose, the outcome often becomes stronger. Not because the couple suddenly become professional models, but because everyone involved understands what matters emotionally. That shared understanding creates trust, and trust changes photography. Not every couple wants this, and that's okay. Now, with all that said, I also think it's important to acknowledge something honestly. Not every couple wants this kind of experience, and that's completely okay. Some couples simply want beautiful coverage, efficient coverage, straightforward documentation. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Not every wedding needs to become an artistic collaboration. Not every couple wants to think deeply about photography philosophy. Some people simply want someone talented and reliable to photograph the day well. That's valid. But I also think there are couples who are looking for something a little more intentional, something more emotionally connected, something more collaborative. And over time, I've realized that those are often the couples I naturally connect with most deeply. Couples who not only care about what the photographs look like, but how the experience feels. Couples who understand that meaningful photographs are not simply manufactured through equipment or editing styles, but through relationships, presence, comfort, trust, and shared experience. Those are the couples who often resonate most strongly with my work and my approach. And honestly, that realization probably shaped the ebook more than anything else. Why the ebook exists. At some point, I realized that photographs alone could not fully communicate the process behind meaningful wedding imagery. And that's really why I wrote the ebook. Not because I thought the world desperately needed another photography guide, but because I wanted couples to understand something deeper about the experience itself. I wanted transparency. I wanted conversation. I wanted couples to feel less intimidated by photography, less pressured, less performative, and more connected to the experience than they were actually living. This ebook is not about teaching couples how to become photographers. It's about helping them understand how meaningful photographs are often created, through collaboration, through communication, through intentionality, through trust, and through emotional presence. And honestly, I think writing the ebook also helped me clarify my own philosophy for myself. Because over time, I realized I wasn't just photographing weddings. I was creating environments where people could feel comfortable enough to be themselves. That's a very different thing. And I think that realization changed the way I think about photography entirely. What I've learned over time. Early in my career, like many photographers, I was focused heavily on technical growth. I was focused on lighting, equipment, composition, editing, sharpness, creative experimentation, publication, portfolio development, and all of that matters. Technical skills matter. Artistic growth matters. But over time, I started noticing something. The photographs couples connected with most emotionally were often not the most technically complicated images. They were the images that felt honest, present, human, and connected. Gradually, I realized that meaningful wedding photographer is deeply human before it is technical. Technical skills help create consistency, but emotional awareness creates connection, and connection is often what people remember years later. Not just how something looked, but how it felt. I think that realization changed me as a photographer, and honestly, probably as a person too, because photography eventually becomes less about controlling moments and more about recognizing them. Less about performance and more about presence. Wrapping things up. At the end of the day, I think that's really what this ebook became for me. An attempt to explain the part of wedding photography that photographs alone cannot fully communicate. The collaboration, the trust, the emotional experience, the shared process behind meaningful imagery, Because years from now, the photographs that matter most probably won't simply remind couples what their wedding looked like. It will remind them of what it felt like, what it felt to stand together, to slow down, to laugh, to feel nervous, to feel present, and to be surrounded by the people they loved. And I think the strongest wedding photography preserves not only appearance, but emotional memory. If you'd like to read the ebook, Creating Meaningful Wedding Images Together is available as a free download on my website or on Amazon. And whether you're currently planning a wedding, working in photography, or simply interested in the creative process behind meaningful images, I hope this conversation gave you a little more insight into why I felt compelled to write it in the first place. Thank you so much for listening to In Focus with Ken Clough Photography. I'm Ken Clough, and until next time, stay present, stay creative, and keep focusing on what matters most.